official ideology that this was a country of exiles. There was one culture and everyone fitted into it. So I think this is something that I want you to touch on if you could.
Well, thank you. First, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be here because when I was a kid, we grew up with this song, Jive, Jive, Jive, Pakistan, Pakistan, Pakistan, Jive, Pakistan. So I think it was a very late trip on my behalf. And it's extraordinary to be with these two gentlemen who both are annoyingly smart and intellectuals. So I'm really loving this. It's my book. You know how you just. The next time I'm going to name my book, I'm going to be very careful because I wrote Exile in 2010. When just before things really got worse in the Middle East, before the Syrians started their runaway from the country, I started more with an internal feeling of exile, and the thing that really made me write the book was a piece that I read in the newspaper. It was about an Iraqi family who was trying to hide from the American soldiers who just busted their house in the middle of the evening, and it touched me so much. I was like, what are those soldiers doing there in the middle of the night it could be me, it could be my mom crying after me, so it just didn't leave me, that piece. This is really how it all started. And then I just cut it. I've always been a very good reader, both journals like papers and magazines and books, but I just cut it and I just didn't know what to do with it. And I started cutting other pieces and I was like, I don't know why I'm doing this. And then after a point, you have this really, really spiritual, inspirational moment where a book just dictates itself. And then the book just spoke to me. I know it's gonna sound crazy. I'm not crazy, maybe I am. I don't care. I just love writing. So it just spoke to me, and I said, oh, you want to be a book. So that's how it all started. And then I realized by cutting these pieces that somehow all these things that I read in the newspapers, actually, which are all dramatic stories that you just read and forget, read and forget. Sometimes we just don't even want to read it because, we think if we don't read it, it just doesn't exist, or if we forget it, it just doesn't exist, but it does. It does exist. So when I just found out that they are about human rights, women rights, kids' rights, and then this internal feeling of being exiled, having raised in a very compared to minorities, compared to Kurdish, Alevis, or Zazas, or Armenians, or Jewish that are living in Turkey, I'm a very mainstream Turkish. I'm coming from a on paper Sunni family. My family was liberal, but they were very humanistic, but even I had a feeling of inner exile, and I think that came from being a woman. I see many men here, so please do not get sad or just don't take it personally. It's just my experience. So having raised as a little girl in an Anatolian big city, but still Anatolian, I always felt kind of an outsider, and I felt like sort of an exile. And it just added when my family didn't allow me to become an artist. They just wanted me to become a businesswoman. I wanted to write. That's the only thing I wanted to do. So, and I didn't eat meat. I didn't like meat. My father was like, which family are you coming from, not liking meat? What do you mean? So I just had these all alien things in me that I was born with, and I just didn't know what to do with them. So that's maybe how I could empathize, I could understand all those people who felt sort of out of the society, who felt alienated, who felt in sort of a spiritual or physical exile. That's how the book came together.
And I think it should be said that when you say that you're capturing things that are kind of evanescent, they appear in the newspapers and then they disappear. You're kind of memorializing. You're erecting something that is more lasting. in their memory. But you're doing it in a language which is extremely direct. These very short sentences and often quite colloquial expressions. So it's not a formal kind of Turkish. It's an extremely accessible kind of Turkish that I think will translate extremely well. I'm thinking about the one. It's full of interesting characters and memorable characters. There is one particularly moving episode which is about an honor killing. And what is interesting is that there are two perspectives employed in the way that you describe this honor killing, because you describe it once and then you return to it later in the book. Would you just explain why you did that and what you were hoping to achieve?
It was some of the, well, like I think more than half of the stories in Exile are based on newspaper clippings, but of course I turned them into fiction because I only write fiction. I edited magazines, but I'm a fiction writer, so I really twisted them, turned them, made them into something new. But this was a real story I read. This girl living in a village was killed by her 3 brothers, and then I was really astonished and I was mesmerized to read it because this is exactly what the news said. The younger brother goes, or was it the bigger brother? It's been younger brother. It's been too long.
I read it last night.
The younger brother, after 9 years after the murder, goes to the police and he says, "We killed our sister. She's in my dreams every night." This is what the story, the news was about. And then I gave the girl a voice. What really hurt me was more the mother knew. So it was the father who ordered the murder. It was the younger brother who committed the murder because he was younger, so he would go to the juvenile prison and get quicker. And it was then the mother who just ignored it. So after all the investigations, the mother said, "I know I did wrong, and I have a very bad conscience about it." At least she had a bad conscience about it, good news. But she said, "They're my sons, I lost one girl, and I don't want to lose 3 more children." And I can also understand that. Understanding doesn't mean I agree with her, but I do get her as a mother. So it's such an awful situation from every point of view. So in one piece, I gave the girl a voice. She explains how they killed her.
Now this is obviously extremely daring, because it's very difficult to give a dead person a voice. I know that.
I hope it was okay.
Orhan Pamuk did it in My Name Is Red. If you remember. How did you come to that decision that you had a victim, but you were going to give a posthumous voice to that victim?
I don't know. I said the poor girl maybe can at least talk after she's dead in my book.
Yeah, very good. Well, that's what fiction's about. It's about doing the impossible. Thomas, you came to Turkey at a time, I suppose, of great optimism in Turkey. Istanbul, one of the coolest places on earth, incredibly attractive place to go and live, that fabled meeting place of East and West. But you, whether you wanted to or not, came with a certain amount of baggage because, of course, Europeans have been in the Middle East before, and they have written about the Middle East before. And they've often written with a perspective and a view that is now considered to be restricted, old-fashioned, prejudiced, or even just elevating what is banal and ordinary to something magical and wonderful because it's so different. So you came with this cultural baggage. And I wonder if you were influenced by other people when you came, what your thinking was when you arrived, and how you thought about that baggage that you were bringing.
Yeah, well, I would say exactly. I think it's interesting that many courses of Turkish literature, as with many literature courses, will look at the sort of tropes of Orientalism, post-colonial literature. But when you arrive in a country like Turkey, and when you're working in the media, you realize the ways in which those tropes have either continue or have changed into new, different forms. And I think it was very eye-opening to see how little people outside of the country wanted to know about Turkey beyond the kind of big set pieces, which at the time were about whether Turkey would join the EU, and always a question about Islamism versus secularism, which is, was a particularly reductive way to deal with a very complicated situation. I would say that one of the books that I read quite early on when I came to Istanbul was your book, Rebel Land, which starts out with which is, I think, was actually...
That was not rehearsed. Don't worry.
But it's true that it was actually, particularly the introduction of that book, you speak very eloquently about kind of the stakes of writing as a journalist, but writing the truth as you see it when you know many of the people around you, whether they are other people from your country or people in Turkey as well, will find that difficult to read and will shun you to a certain extent for that. And I think that, obviously, when...
So why would that be difficult for them? Why would they shun you as a result?
Well, so, I mean, obviously, many of the issues around the Kurdish situation...
So it's a subject matter. So yeah. Rebel Land is essentially about the southeastern part of Turkey, which is hugely contested because the Turkish line is that this is part of Turkey, and the Kurds are saying, no, this is part of Kurdistan, and the Armenians are saying, well, this is actually historically part of Armenia. So yeah.
Exactly, and there's a great sort of set piece in which you have sort of Armenian tourists coming to photograph the ruins of places where their ancestors would have lived, where Kurdish villagers now live in a place that is, Turkey. So there are these sort of historical layers are incredibly complicated to unpack, and for most people reading a newspaper in, back in London, they don't necessarily even want to begin to deal with the complexity that you need to have to start to understand really what's kind of going on, but whether in literature or in politics or in, the cinema or any cultural production in Turkey.
Do you think that it's possible in our day and age, with our extraordinary potential for communication simply from sitting at home, do you think that idea of getting up and going to a place, as you did in Turkey, is still important, more important, less important? Does it retain its importance?
Oh, I think it's extremely important, but I would say that ease of travel and ease of communication, this has been discussed at other panels much more eloquently than I could possibly put it, but I don't think necessarily leads to any greater understanding. And I think it's very easy to go to the south of Turkey to town in the summer where there are towns which are almost entirely filled with English, German tourists who have very little engagement with the place itself, and very little engagement with the fact that maybe the town that they're in was once Greek, and that during the exchange of populations in the earlier 20th century, the Turkish people who now live there have only been there for a few generations. So, it's just, there are so many layers that are very, kind of obviously, maybe if you're on the beach, you don't really want to engage with them. But I think it's sad that people don't, and it's hard to be a mediator between those two things.
Yeah, I want to get onto that in a minute. Before I do so, I just want to say, I want to return to that point you said about people arriving in people going to Turkey and simply thinking there's one issue, and it's the issue of Islamism against secularism, which of course is vital, but much more complicated than you can put in one sentence. And I was sent Pakistanis will know all about how outsiders reduce their country to a single sentence or to a single dichotomy or to one dilemma, and they will say, well, actually it's much more complicated than that, and everything you're discussing I am living with, and I haven't worked it out, so how come you've worked it out in one sentence? And this, I received a link from a friend of mine, an Iranian friend of mine, who has just taken a film which he made to one of the European film festivals. And the link is of him being interviewed in a press conference. And I don't know what the question is, but I can imagine what the question is, because what he is saying is roughly this. Why is it every time I come to a foreign film festival, all you do is ask about censorship? And all you do is ask whether the reformists like the film and the conservatives like the film, and how it is to work with censorship. Yes, censorship exists. It's a pain in the arse. We live with it. But why don't you ask me about making the film, about the themes in the film, about the characters in the film? And it was as if there was no... It was obvious from his visible anger that he'd just got to that point. He was just no longer willing to have that conversation, which reduced everything to a single tagline. When you were in Turkey, you worked for a glossy cultural magazine that was aimed at foreign tourists, beautifully produced, but at the same time, you learnt the Turkish language, or you perfected your Turkish language. And I want to know how that process of learning a language, now this is not an Indo-European language, it's not a language that you or we find very easy. Everything is turned around. The structure of the sentence is completely different, and the intonation and the emphases are all very different. So how was it for you learning the Turkish language, and what new perspective did that bring on Turkey itself in your mind?
Well, I mean, it was enormously difficult, I would add, because it is a very difficult language, if coming from outside of that language family. I think it's interesting because it's such an enormous barrier, because there are many countries in which a journalist can arrive and in a couple of months, or work out what's going on. And I think that it's only gradually through learning the language that you begin to realize. I mean, the level of I don't know. I don't think there's any way that you can begin to sort of pontificate or really assess the situation until you have the language, because and it's very, as I say, it's a difficult process. Did your relationship with Turkish people change when you started speaking? Yes, of course. Yeah. And it was absolutely key. And I think the other thing I would say is that the people that you will meet in Turkey who tend to speak English, and this is obviously the case, I'm sure, globally, tend to be from a certain sector of society. And I think a lot of people who come to Turkey can be subsumed into that type of society and just assume that those opinions and those political views and that way of seeing the country is the only way to see the country. And I think that's also a particularly dangerous sort of path to go down. And I think, because generally speaking, those people tend to be fairly internationally looking, but to have a very set of political views. Both of you, you were in Turkey at a time when the Erdogan dream was starting to unravel. People were starting to ask questions about Turkey's foreign policy. The policy towards Syria was just about to change when you arrived. And also, internal opposition to Erdogan was increasing, which had the effect of increasing international exposure and also international interest in Turkey. It's also a time when those Turkish writers were starting to be heard a little bit more outside the country. Translation was starting to happen. Elif Shafak was achieving her great sort of fame that she has now achieved. And others were coming forward and and people were taking an interest in them. And I want to turn back to you, because you've observed this entire process. Would you say that increasing connectedness has helped literature in Turkey?
Of course, now Turkey is on the scene for the last few years. I think journalists ask more questions to writers, and then it's easier to sell Turkish writers because you just keep hearing about Turkey. But actually what happened in the 10 years and nobody sees was like a revolutionary cooperation of publishing houses, the few literary agents that really just came up in Turkey, and all those, a number of intellectuals who were really trying together, including the government, the cultural ministry and its funds, and other like other publishing association. All those associations made a deliberate act together to translate Turkish literature abroad, to export it, and it's been going on for almost 10 years now. So I think what we see is the invisible backstage cooperation and outcome of it. So this, of course, people don't know, but this is a fact, because I have an agent, I know how they work together, and we have an international festival, a literature festival in Istanbul for 10 years, and we host incredible writers, which really helps, because then you bring publishers, you bring the book fair owners, organizers, and they meet each other, so it's a tremendous help. But of course, now it's easier to sell or to promote Turkish writers because of the hot political situation.
So the political situation, which is of course tense, makes Turkey very attractive to foreign buyers, to whether they be publishing houses, translators, that kind of thing.
I think so, and I see a danger to this, because we really have very good writers, but at some point your publishing house abroad might demand you to write something political because it would sell more. I think as a writer you really shouldn't be trapped into that, because politicians are politicians, journalists are journalists. Of course we work together, but I think literature should keep its naive love of words still.
And do you think in this period, which has also coincided with the entry of the English language into kind of middle class life? When I first went to Turkey in 1996, there was literally no one. I mean, literally no one spoke English. Or very, very few people spoke English. And now the use of the English language is much, much more widespread. That is also, how has that affected things? And also, how has that affected the Turkish language?
I think it's funny, years ago, like when I was a kid, Turkey was really more different, more maybe primitive, less global. Not that every global value is valuable, I don't mean that, but to a bunch of tourists who came to see the historical sites, I don't know where this came from. The kids would say, "Hello, donkey." I don't know. Now I find it so bad. But those times I didn't mind it. And then there are a few things, I think, with the English language entering Turkey. I have to take credit on my generation. We are the X generation in our 40s, and our generation has generated, let me see if I can use another generated word, man. Let me not push it too much. Artists, like not only writers, artists, movie directors, really performing artists, because we spoke English, and it makes such a difference to open up to the world. So our generation had a lot of effect on it, and I think internet, like the digital age, because you get exposed to English so much without knowledge, then you now know a few words more than "hello donkey" because you get exposed to it.
And how has that affected the Turkish language? Do you think the Turkish language has changed as a result? Are you a different writer in this book as a result of knowing the English language and having read books in English?
I hope not. I think I'm not, I hope not, because I find Turkish beautiful, and it's one of the things that I miss the most in the Netherlands. I live in the Netherlands for the last 7 months. But of course, as with every language, it did affect the Turkish language, and we use much more English words, and then sometimes the sentence is like a bundle of words in a few languages. But it's funny, the Dutch people are also going through, they're also having this conversation with Dutch and English, and every person, and I mean every person, I haven't had one single Dutch person that doesn't speak English. And it's not like, you know, just 2-3 words, they just, oh, sorry, they understand that you don't speak Dutch and they just switch to English. And then, so even but they still want to keep their language. So I think it's, as it is in every country, yes, Turkish language is being affected. And not only the language itself by the world and phonetic, but I think the way of expression is also being affected with the digital age, as in every country. The sentences get shorter, and so there is this new way of talking, new way of expressing, a new way of shortening the words that just actually wouldn't mean anything, but then there is this kind of Uber language that everybody understands, like you say, hello, but you would write HL and then you would get it like hello in Turkish. So yes, it did affect, yeah.
So merhaba is hello in Turkish. What do you put? What's the shortened?
We tend to take out the vowels and then you would say MRHB.
Merhaba. In India...
Not I write long versions.
In India recently, I was astonished to see how the Hindi language has become... there was always a certain amount of English words in Hindi when I used to live there, but now the language has become a kind of it's a complete soup of English and Hindi. And at the Jaipur Literary Festival, I attended a panel in which writers in Hindi were saying, this is awful. We've got a language which is now Hinglish, and our young people don't speak Hindi anymore, and they don't really, they don't have that sense, that feeling for the language. And what are we going to do about it? And then from there I went into a panel which was by Rajasthani writers. And the Rajasthani writers, they were speaking in Hindi, and they said, isn't it awful that no one speaks Rajasthani anymore? So you have this constant sort of battle, tension between languages, and there's always a dominant language. Before we return to the UK, which I want to do with you, I want to see how you observed this interaction between Turkey in the West in literary terms and in journalistic terms when you were there. We've established that Turkey is on the world stage. We've established that there's a lot of interest in it, but is it useful interest?
Well, I mean, that's yeah. Whether it's useful interest is an interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things to talk to. I mean, the nature of the language itself, in terms of its difficulty and but also its richness, I think is very much part and parcel of the way in which it is part of Turkish literature itself, obviously, because it was a language that came out of the language reform in the early 1920s. Many writers throughout the 20th century were dealing with the nature of language itself and very consciously using certain types of words, whether they were Persian and Arabic words that had fallen out of use, or Turkish words that had been invented or refound. And so that obviously poses a very difficult question when it comes to any sort of translation. And I think it has a tendency to take away a whole layer of what's going on in these books, and so therefore make it easier to sort of say, well, this book is about, you know, this political issue, or this book is about that political issue. I mean, I don't know necessarily that Turkish literature is, unfortunately, widely read enough to make, on the global stage, to sort of really change people's opinions about the country. I mean, perhaps Orhan Pamuk is so well known that he might begin to have the stage to do that, but I'm not totally convinced that the interest works in that way. And
what about writers coming in from the outside and using Turkey as a canvas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it's sort of there's
and this is journalism as well. I'm talking about journalism and literature.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. I still think you have a lot of projection. I mean, I had sort of while I was in Turkey and shortly afterwards, with a friend of mine, we started a small online publication, which was basically came out of a conversation that we had about where we said that any article that begins with describing Istanbul in particular, but Turkey in general as a bridge between East and West, we just would stop reading. But the problem was that then you stop reading any article in English about the country and you sort of think at some point, what do we actually mean by that? I mean, you could say the same of Cairo, you could say the same of Sarajevo, you could say the same of Lahore. I think that's just a net part of the globalized world. I think also no one really, but I mean, these categories are kind of meaningless. I think there's a lot of laziness, there's a lot of projection, there's a lot of people going and wanting to have the experience, and maybe they do a little bit, but they don't quite, but they still write about it. And I think, I don't know, I think it is a dangerous trope, and I don't think it's been sort of escaped from. I mean, people now tend to ask me, if I bring up Turkey, they say, and I'm sure, Ciler, you have the same thing, but they say, is it getting worse? And you sort of think, what kind of a question is that? I mean, the way in which people don't, it's generally speaking, people don't want nuance, I suppose, but it's a kind of depressing vision of it. But I mean, obviously there are a lot of very good journalists working in Turkey, international journalists who are doing very, very, very excellent work. But I think particularly your sort of Sunday supplement type coverage of cultural aspects of the country tends to be fairly lazy.
Yeah, I think we can all agree it can often be very, very limited. The Gezi protests were a kind of watershed, or maybe they weren't. Maybe that's just another trope. The Gezi protests, which saw a large coalition of people gather in central Istanbul to protest ostensibly against some changes to the urban environment, but in fact ballooned into something much bigger. They were participated in by different sections of society, not simply old-fashioned secularists, but young, properly liberal types, Kurds who didn't like the government's anti-Kurdish policy, Alevis, the main religious minority in Turkey, which are perhaps 20% of the population, a very, very large minority. How did you feel that that was represented, if at all, in the media and also in literature? Did that have a change? And what's your feeling about the way that the West covered the Gezi protests? Did they get it right?
Yes, I think it was reflected in many outlets in the right way, because for us, Gezi was one of the first, or the first, mass protests that started as a sign of democratic rights. So living in a state, you have the right to protest the regulations of the government, or if a park in the middle of the city is trees are cut down and it just wants to be like no park. So it was a practice of democracy for us, for the Turkish people, and it was the first time that a lot of people said, wow, so we can actually do this. We are a democratic country where you can just go out the street and say something, and then things got out of hand. But I think a lot of journalists read the analysis correct, in the sense that it was a democratic movement. It started as a democratic movement, and it was the first time that the so-called white Turkish people understood what it is to be a minority in Turkey, and which isn't pretty, because the police was gassing them, they were beating them, and we had cameras, everybody was online. Even if the government cut the internet, we would go through internet from other sources. We had access to BBC, CNN, we had friends working there, we could report to them, and despite that, a lot of people were hurt. And it was the first time that a lot of people thought, wow, so this can be really brutal. Even in the middle of Istanbul, we're exposed to this tense violence and brutalism. So I think it was really very meaningful that a lot of people from different backgrounds, gays, lesbians, communists, Alevis, Kurdish, Turkish, they were really one soul, one body. So it was important in being like brothers, sisters, and as a democratic movement. And I think generally it was read correct.
The irony, of course, is that this lady who's written a book called Exile now finds herself an exile. And I don't mean the pleasant exile of coming to the Lahore Literary Festival. Will you tell us why that happened and what it has meant for you?
Yeah, that's why I'm going to maybe name my book, third book, Peace, Love, Heaven, whatever. Oh, I don't know. I didn't really think I would leave Turkey so early. We always thought we would at some point live in the Netherlands because my husband is half Norwegian, half Dutch, half Turkish. And then we have British relatives. So we always knew that our daughter, we wanted her to connect with her European half because she would maybe grow up in Turkey until 18, and then. But then we just found out that we didn't feel comfortable anymore in Turkey. For me. One feeling was very dominant. I never felt unsafe in Istanbul, although it is maybe not as chaotic as some parts of Lahore, but as chaotic as many other big cities. But I never ever, of course I wouldn't go to dangerous parts alone by myself in the middle of the night, but I would go to film festivals in Istanbul, in Taksim, and I would return home at 12 on my own. But there was this one time, it was I think 2 years ago, I was walking from the subway to my house in Levant, and it was only like 7. I just felt scared. I thought somebody was following me. It happened to me for the first time in Istanbul, and I was really sort of panicking because just before that, a man beat a pregnant woman, and he wasn't charged for it. And the only reason was like, why aren't you home and doing sports in the park? You're a woman, you're a pregnant woman. So when law doesn't protect you, it becomes really more scary for a woman. So that was the point, and I came home and I told my husband, I don't feel safe anymore. So that was, and we have a daughter as well, so that was one of the things. And the second thing is, I'm a writer, and I always had full-time jobs just to write whatever I want to write. And it was both like, I had to supply my family with a job, with my husband. I had no time to write. I was always tired. I was trying to write. But then I didn't want a publisher who would be on my back. Come on, finish your book. I didn't want to do that. So I gave up a lot of things for my internal freedom of writing, for my lifestyle, for my sleeps, you know. So I said, I'm not going to do this. I just want to write what I want to write. And I couldn't write anymore what I felt, because what I felt was discomfort in Turkey. So that's basically why we moved.
Thomas, you returned to England, and you're now editing Tank magazine, which I alluded to earlier. Tank magazine is, well, in a country that celebrates diversity, Tank is probably, you know, it's up there. It's a very diverse publication in terms of contributors, readership, everything. But what you've tapped into, and I think what that you were telling me yesterday, is that you have a sense through Tank of communicating with a young audience that is very, very motivated. And this is something that's quite new for me, to think that people in London, young people in London, are very, very motivated politically. I want you to give us a sense of that, because I think that, you know, if London's youth is motivated, other youth is motivated as well. There's a kind of correspondence between places and ideas that will inevitably filter through.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we really find at Tank, and I think is that as people become more informed or more able to inform themselves, in particular young people, they're less willing to put up with the traditional gatekeepers telling them in a lazy way what a certain place is like, what certain types of literature are like, what they should be reading, what they should be doing, and politically who they should be engaging with. And what we've seen is that we have in terms of our young readership, there are a lot of people who are very keen on the fact that our magazine has a political edge, but is also a lifestyle magazine, and who also want to come to events, to come to spaces in which they can talk, to have a sense of engagement with the title, with the place, and with the subjects that are being spoken about. And I think what's really interesting is that I think we're at a tipping point where a certain type of approach to countries, a certain type of approach to the literature or politics or whatever it is, to countries has to end because of this, because of people's commitment, because of their interest in engagement, and because it's very easy to see when a newspaper is being lazy on these sorts of topics. So I think it's a very positive moment. I would also say that the last few years, in particular, even the last 2 years, Turkish literature in translation in English has increased. I mean, there are a number of very important people like the Kalem agency, who I know represent Ciler, and also Maureen Freely, the translator. There are many people who are really spearheading the introduction of books that otherwise would be ignored by publishers who think, oh, no one's going to be interested in that. And putting a spotlight onto these writers that really do, and that it seems to me are selling well. So, yeah, it's a positive image, I think.
We're going to wrap up this section of the session now. I think that we have had a very panoptic view, not only of Turkey and the possibilities that are open to writers there, both Turkish and foreign, but also I hope you've got a sense of those threads that link the experience of our two panelists with your own, and I've certainly had a sense of how they link with mine. A sense at the same time of being apart, but also being together and sharing the same experiences through language, through translation, and through the transmission of thoughts that, although they may be about a woman in a village in rural Turkey, somehow speak far more resonantly than that, and with a far wider echo. So I want to throw open the floor to questions. Do we have a microphone? This young gentleman has been nodding and is so enthusiastic. He's now grabbed the microphone.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarmad Iqbal, and I'm a Pakistani blogger and an undergraduate student. My question is for Ma'am Ciler Ilhan. Günaydın, merhaba.
Merhaba.
Nasılsınız?
İyiyim, siz nasılsınız?
Sağ ol. I've learned Turkish on my own through listening to Turkish pop music of singers like Hande Yener and Demet Akalın, and watching Turkish movies
There you go.
that of Mehmet Gunsul. My question is for you that, as a Turkish writer, what's the difference you have seen between the life in Turkey under the secular regimes of Cemal Gürsel and Kenan Evren and the current Islamist regime of Mr. Erdogan? Is there any difference between those secular regimes and the current Islamist regime? Because Turkey, the current republic, was predicated on the secular model of Mr. Atatürk.
Thank you.
Secular regime and Erdogan regime, Islamist regime. Before answering the question, I would like to give a background. You know, Turkish Republic, as the way it is a young republic. And things take time to transform people. You cannot just enforce people. You cannot just give them a pill that will make them secular or enlightened. I think since the foundation of Republic, we actually never had democracy. It was either the military regime interrupting on and off, or one-party regime, or totally dysfunctional coalition, where things usually went wrong. And so with that perspective, for 50 years, the Islamic people were despised and suppressed. And now secular people are being despised and suppressed, which aren't right for me. So we still, as a Turkey, we still need to find a way to be really democratic, to listen to each other. You know, we are a very young nation in that means. So, of course, there are differences, but I think in the sense of being democracy, I never call Turkey a real democracy, and still it's getting tighter. I have to say now, you feel like it's really tighter than it used to be, but maybe the story of the other side also should be listened. So I think we still have a way to go with democracy. Rica ederim, ben teşekkür ederim.
Yes,
Yeah,
Yusuf.
I am Anwarul Haq. I teach English and I write in English for English Literacy Society. My question is about Pamuk, the Nobel laureate novelist of Turkish literature. Please explain what is Pamuk's specific contribution to Turkish literature as a novelist. His contribution,
Yeah.
how he has influenced Turkish literature.
Orhan Pamuk is a writer who many writers are deadly jealous of. Because he's a good writer, he's a real intellectual, very well read, and he doesn't have to work because he's filthy rich. And he won the Nobel. So a lot of people hate him. I think he's a brilliant writer. And he was one of the pioneers of his generation. We had Yaşar Kemal and Oya Baydar and a few more already translated to French, because we had close ties with French when we were trying to learn how to write in our early years. But he had a big part when he was translated to many languages. Then people were like, wow, so there is a crowd who's buying Turkish literature. And then with his winning the Nobel, I think he really put us more on the scene, which helped, I have to say. Thank you.
What
Okay.
about in terms of his subject matter and the approach that he takes to writing novels?
Well, I think now he will. He's very, how do you say, unique in the way he writes, and he always sort of talks about the history, a bit nostalgia, really, really poetic literature. I don't know if he's going to change it. There was only one controversial book in Kars where he was talking about a gay couple. But now Turkish people want to read more Ottoman historical books and everything, but I don't think he's going to change his line. So he is what he is.
Okay, my name is Farooq, and I have honored to be friend of Bellaigue. Friend of Bellaigue. So
Sorry, I'm sorry, because I'm not a native speaker,
I know,
that's
I
why
know,
I
I
don't
know.
understand. I'm
I
sorry.
have been Turkey 45 times, so I know what is the impact of English in Turkish culture. So, but I am amazed that we got the rights of your book, and the
thank you for
organizer.
buying it.
Yes, and I selected as an editor to choose this book, like other more than 100 books I selected, including Nutq, Yaşar Kemal, Idalatolo. I always selected the left-wing books from Turkey. Okay. But I am shocked that you are in Pakistan and you are not informed by organizer that this book has been published officially in Pakistan. I don't know what is the reason. Why they hiding the Urdu edition? This is your book. Darbadar, we translated Surgun. And we got the rights. I don't know why they hided it.
Yes, thank
And-
you.
and
I have the same question.
Yes. And second, maybe I'm not agreed with your point of view, the real democracy and the full democracy, but as a Kemalist and I'm a leftist, I am friend of Bellaigue. I invited him in 93 here in Pakistan. Turkey is the only third world country where the democracy is not the legacy of any colonial system. Even Indian democracy is a legacy of British colonialism. Even Pakistani democracy is a legacy of British colonialism. So there is a democracy. Yes, there are difficult situations, but I'm not agreed, but I'm proud that I'm a Kemalist and a leftist at the same time, because I know the ruthlessness of a dictatorial and male-dominating society which we are facing, which you don't have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Yes, my question is to the panel generally. Now, I know we don't have a lot of time, and there are a million things I would like to ask. Since while discussing Turkey, if you switch many of the labels and some of the geography, you might think that we were having a discussion about Pakistan or about the subcontinent in general, particularly relating to, let's say, ethnic tensions, religious tensions, political issues, issues of language especially. So I think I'd like to limit it to this. Turkey is often held up as a thing for Pakistan to aspire to. And you might all three of you might find this as absurd, but we hold Kemal and Erdogan in the same esteem in Pakistan, and we view them through the same lens. Many Pakistanis view them through the same lens. So, my question.
Yeah, I think that's you've got your point across very well. Do you want to try that?
I mean, I just say I think it's really interesting, and I think it speaks a lot to the way in which we think about the world in general, in that, we're always looking for sort of mirrors of our own situations elsewhere. And I think it's really the more that one drills down into the differences and the specificities that sometimes, things can be eliminated. I think it's not necessarily so helpful to use these examples beyond their own, national borders. I personally would think.
What's your view?
Yeah, it's a difficult answer. As to my editor as well, maybe I will have answered him too. Of course, in an ideal democracy or ideal state, you would really have all parts living happily ever together, but it doesn't usually happen. And maybe compared, I haven't studied Pakistan in detail. I haven't lived here, so I cannot really compare the two countries. But I understand, and I heard it from a lot of people, that Turkey was the symbol of modernism and democracy compared to a lot of Asian and Middle Eastern countries. So everything is relative when we're talking about. So I can relate to that, I can understand that, but you need to understand Kemalism and Kemal and Erdogan were totally two different...
I understand that these two things are very disparate, but...
different people that have opposite views.
Actually, the thing I wanted to ask was, considering all this, is Turkey or something we really should aspire to? Or should we look at nuance more? Because many people say we would like Pakistan to be much more like Turkey.
Yeah. Should Pakistan aspire to be?
Well, I mean, I think the one thing I would say is that obviously in the early noughties, at the beginning of Erdogan's tenure, Turkey was often used as this kind of model for diplomacy in the press. People often referred to it as this state to which other places should aspire. And I think that in a way that created a blindness to some of the realities of what was going on, and I think on the part of international partners such as the EU. I mean, so I think there is definitely holding things up as a model is not necessarily the best way to go.
We've got time for one final question. Who's got the microphone? No, sorry. You'll have to ask afterwards.
The last question, I think so, because time is going on. My question is general, not only for the literature, but all the people who have made questions, they talked about the colonialism, language, and the democracy. I only just want your views of you from both from the Turkey and from UK, that I think as a student that in all the developed nations, they had developed in their own languages. Just Russia, German, Japanese, Chinese, UK, and USA, they all made the development in their own language. But unfortunately, due to the colonialism, we Pakistanis and Indians, we use here in our countries English language, which is not only national language, but not only mother language. What do you think? That any country, any nation can become developed without his own language?
I would just say that, I think it's interesting that a lot of, as I say, because of the language reform that happened in Turkey, I think this is an issue that a lot of Turkish writers have often tried to grapple with and talk about. I think it's
I could add just a final thought. You say that Pakistan and India have not been able to develop in their own language, and it was a colonial language. This is true. But as you hinted, when Turkey underwent its language reform at the end of the Ottoman Empire, Ataturk and his associates transformed the language. They changed the script, so it was impossible to read anything from the past, and they imported a lot of new words, either from European languages or from Central Asian origin, so that it was, within the space of 20 or 30 years, it was impossible for one person to read the old language and understand many of the words in that old language. So this wasn't imposed by colonial power, but it was imposed, and it was a new language. And I think a lot of Turks have struggled with that ever since. What has happened to our language? There wasn't organic growth or organic change. It was sudden and imposed and dictated. So I think this problem is not just confined to countries that have been colonized. A lot of countries have had similar issues with language. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for your close attention and interest and excellent questions. And again, I want to thank my two fellow panelists and guests, Ilhan Ciler and Thomas Roueche. Thank you very much.